I stood at that airport gate watching my husband of 32 years disappear through security, and I smiled. Not the sad, dutiful smile of a woman watching her husband leave for a business trip. No, this was different. This smile came from somewhere deep, somewhere that had been dormant for so long I'd forgotten it existed. He turned back one last time, raised his hand in that casual wave he'd perfected over 3 decades, expecting to see tears streaming down my face like every other time he'd left. Instead, he got that smile. I saw the confusion flicker across his features for just a second before he turned away. He had no idea what was waiting for him when he came back. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted with your entire life, you know that feeling, that moment when something inside you just breaks. But then, if you're lucky, if you're strong enough, something else happens. Something shifts. You stop being the victim and you become something else entirely. Before I go any further, I need you to do something for me. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever felt what I'm about to describe, leave a comment below telling me where you're watching from. And please, check the description box for more stories like this one, stories about women who refused to stay broken. Because what I'm about to tell you, what I did, it changed everything. My name is Eleanor. I'm 63 years old now, and for most of my adult life, I was Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, wife of Robert Patterson, mother of 2, homemaker, volunteer, the woman who smiled at every charity gala while her husband worked the room. I was good at it too. Being the perfect wife. I'd had 32 years of practice. We met when I was 29, fresh out of a bad relationship, working as a legal secretary at a firm in Hartford, Connecticut. Robert was a junior partner then, ambitious and charming in that way that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. He had sandy blonde hair that fell just slightly over his forehead, and he wore these perfectly tailored suits that made him look like he'd stepped out of a magazine. When he asked me to dinner, I said yes without hesitation. The courtship was a whirlwind. 3 months of romantic dinners, weekend trips to Martha's Vineyard, flowers delivered to my tiny apartment in West Hartford. He told me I was beautiful, that I was different from other women he'd dated. He said I had substance, intelligence, grace. All the things a 29-year-old woman who'd just had her heart broken needed to hear. 6 months later, we were married in a small ceremony at his parents' estate in Litchfield County. The first few years were good. Really good. Robert made partner, we bought our first house, a modest colonial in Avon with a yard big enough for the children we were planning. I got pregnant with our daughter, Amanda, within the first year. 2 years later came our son, Christopher. I quit my job to stay home with them, and Robert's career soared. We moved to a bigger house in West Hartford, then an even bigger one in Farmington. By the time Amanda was in high school, we were living in a 6-bedroom estate with a pool and a 3-car garage. From the outside, we were perfect. The American dream incarnate. Robert was now a senior partner at one of the most prestigious law firms in Connecticut. I was on the boards of 3 different charities, hosted dinner parties for his colleagues, and never missed a single one of Amanda's dance recitals or Christopher's lacrosse games. We took family vacations to Europe, spent summers at a rental cottage on Cape Cod, and every Christmas, our holiday card was the kind that made other people feel inadequate. But somewhere along the way, I can't pinpoint exactly when, things started to change. Or maybe they didn't change. Maybe I just finally started to see what had always been there. Robert started traveling more. Business trips to Boston, New York, Chicago, sometimes lasting a week or more. He'd always traveled for work, but this felt different. He was distant when he was home, always on his phone, always distracted. When I tried to talk to him about it, he'd tell me I was being paranoid, that the firm was demanding, that he was working towards senior partner status, that all of this was for us, for our future. I believed him. Or I wanted to believe him. Because what was the alternative? That the man I'd spent 3 decades building a life with, the father of my children, was lying to me? The first ray crack appeared on a Tuesday evening in October, 3 years ago. I was looking for my phone charger and picked up Robert's iPad from his nightstand. It wasn't locked, we'd never had secrets, or so I thought, and when the screen lit up, I saw a text message notification from a contact saved simply as J. Can't wait to see you this weekend. I've missed you. My hands started shaking. I told myself it was nothing, probably just a colleague, maybe someone from the firm. But something in my gut twisted. I opened the message thread. What I found made the room spin. Months of messages. Dozens of them. Intimate, affectionate, sexual. Messages about hotel rooms and stolen weekends and how much they missed each other. How much he missed her. And then I saw the photos. Not explicit, but intimate enough. A woman with auburn hair and a bright smile, lying in what was clearly a hotel bed, wearing one of Robert's dress shirts. I sat down on the edge of our bed, the bed we'd shared for 32 years, and I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, like someone had wrapped steel bands around my ribs and was slowly tightening them. I scrolled through months of evidence of my husband's betrayal, and with each message, something inside me crumbled a little more. Her name was Jessica. She was 34 years old, a marketing consultant he'd met through work. They'd been seeing each other for over a year. More than a year of lies, of business trips that weren't really business trips, of late nights at the office that were spent in hotel rooms with her. I should have confronted him right then. I should have thrown his iPad at his head when he walked through the door an hour later. But I didn't. Instead, I carefully placed the iPad back exactly where I'd found it, went downstairs, and made dinner like nothing had happened. That night, as I lay beside him in the dark, listening to him snore softly, I realized something that terrified me. I had no idea who this man was. The person I thought I knew, the person I'd trusted with my entire adult life, was a stranger. And I had no idea what to do about it. The next few months were a special kind of torture. I played the perfect wife while dying inside. I smiled at the right times, laughed at his jokes, attended his firm's holiday party and made polite conversation with partners and associates, all while wondering if they knew. If they'd known all along. If I was the only fool in the room. I checked his messages obsessively whenever I had the chance. I watched the affair continue, evolve. I read messages where he told her he loved her. Where he said he'd leave me eventually, that he just needed to wait for the right time, until the kids were more settled, until after Christopher's graduation. Every word was a knife in my chest. But something else was happening too. Beneath the pain and humiliation, something harder was forming. Something cold and calculating. Because the more I read, the more I learned, the more I realized something crucial. Robert thought I was weak. He thought I was dependent on him, that I had nowhere to go, nothing of my own. He thought I would stay no matter what, because what choice did I have? He had no idea he was wrong. It started with a single phone call to an attorney I found through a friend of a friend. Someone Robert didn't know, someone from a firm in New Haven, far enough away that word wouldn't get back to him. Her name was Patricia Brennan, a divorce attorney with a reputation for being ruthless in court and compassionate with her clients. I needed both. I remember sitting in her office on a gray February morning, my hands wrapped around a cup of coffee I couldn't drink, telling her everything. The affair, the messages, the photos. The 32 years of marriage and the 2 adult children and the big house in Farmington and the life we'd built together. And then I told her what I wanted. Patricia leaned back in her chair, studying me with sharp blue eyes. She was probably in her early 50s, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, and she didn't mince words. She told me exactly how ugly divorce could get, especially with someone like Robert who had resources and connections. She told me I needed to be prepared for a battle. But then I told her about the house. And everything changed. The house we lived in, the 6-bedroom estate with the pool and the perfectly manicured lawn, had been purchased 15 years ago. Robert had been so busy with work at the time that he'd asked me to handle most of the paperwork. I'd worked with the real estate agent, coordinated with the mortgage broker, attended all the closings. And when it came time to sign the deed, Robert had been in Boston for a deposition. He told me to go ahead and sign everything, that he'd add his name later. He never did. For 15 years that house, worth almost $2 million now, had been in my name only. Solely and completely mine. Robert had never bothered to check, never thought to add himself to the deed. Why would he? We were married. What was mine was his, right? Wrong. Patricia's expression when I told her this was something I'll never forget. She actually smiled. Connecticut is an equitable distribution state, she explained. In a divorce, assets are divided fairly, but not necessarily equally. However, property owned by one spouse prior to the marriage, or property titled solely in one spouse's name with clear evidence it was intended as separate property, could be argued as non-marital. With the right documentation, the right strategy, she could make a case that the house was mine. It wouldn't be easy. Robert would fight. He'd argue that despite the deed, it was marital property purchased with marital funds. But we had something he didn't: surprise. And time to prepare. Over the next 6 months, I became someone I didn't recognize. During the day, I was still Eleanor Patterson, dutiful wife. I still made Robert's favorite meals, still did his laundry, still slept beside him at night. But every spare moment, every second he was at work or with her, I was planning. Patricia and I built an airtight case. We documented everything. I gathered bank statements showing that the down payment for the house had come from an inheritance I'd received from my grandmother. Money that was legally mine before the marriage, even though we'd married before buying the house. I found the original documentation showing I'd been the only one at the closing. I collected evidence of Robert's affair, screenshots of messages, photos, a timeline of his trips that corresponded with Jessica's social media posts. I also started separating our finances, slowly and carefully. I opened my own bank account at a different bank. I had my social security checks. I'd started collecting early retirement, deposited there. I transferred small amounts of money from our joint account, never enough to raise suspicion, but enough to build a cushion. And I waited. Christopher graduated from Boston College in May. It was a beautiful ceremony, and I cried watching my son walk across that stage, but not for the reasons Robert thought. I was crying because I knew what was coming. Because I knew that once this milestone passed, I was free to act. Amanda was already settled in Chicago, working for an advertising agency and living with her boyfriend of 3 years. Christopher had accepted a job in San Francisco starting in August. My children were grown, launched, living their own lives. The last thread holding me back was gone. But I needed one more thing. I needed Robert out of the house long enough for me to take complete control of the situation. I needed him gone when the papers were served, when the locks were changed, when reality came crashing down around him. And then, like a gift from the universe, it happened. In early July, Robert came home and announced he had a business trip to London. A major international client, a week-long negotiation, absolutely critical. He'd be leaving at the end of the month. I nodded, asked appropriate questions about his trip, and when he left the room, I allowed myself a small smile. The timing was perfect. I called Patricia immediately. We moved up our timeline. The divorce papers would be filed the day after Robert left. The locks would be changed that same afternoon. I'd arranged for Christopher to come home for a few days, ostensibly to help me with some home repairs before he moved to San Francisco, but really because I needed him there when I told him and Amanda what was happening. I couldn't let them hear about it from their father. The 2 weeks before Robert's trip were surreal. I moved through each day in a strange fog, present but disconnected. I memorized every room in that house, every corner of the life we'd built. Part of me mourned what I was about to destroy. But a larger part of me felt something I hadn't felt in years: powerful. If you're still watching this, if you're someone who's ever felt trapped in a relationship, trapped by circumstances or fear or the weight of years invested, I want you to hear this: it's never too late to take your life back. Never. Subscribe if you haven't already, and check the description for more stories about women who refused to stay victims. Because what happened next? It changed everything. The night before Robert left, we had dinner together. I'd made his favorite, grilled salmon with roasted vegetables, a nice Chardonnay. We sat at our dining room table, the same table where we'd hosted dozens of dinner parties, and he talked about London, about the client, about how important this trip was. I nodded and smiled and asked questions. And I thought about Jessica, about how she'd texted him earlier that day saying she'd miss him while he was gone. About how he'd texted back saying he'd make it up to her when he returned. About how he had no idea that when he returned, everything would be different. After dinner, I helped him pack. I folded his shirts carefully, selected his ties, made sure he had everything he needed. He thanked me, kissed my forehead, told me he'd miss me. I said I'd miss him too. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed next to him, watching the clock, waiting for dawn. The morning of July 28th was bright and clear, the kind of summer day that makes Connecticut look like a postcard. Robert's flight was at 11, which meant we needed to leave for Bradley International by 8:30. I woke him at 6, made coffee and scrambled eggs, and we ate breakfast in the sunroom overlooking the pool. He was in a good mood, excited about the trip, about London. He'd always loved international travel, loved the prestige of being the attorney chosen for these important negotiations. He talked about the hotel where he'd be staying, some luxury place in Mayfair. I listened and nodded and poured more coffee. At 8:15, we loaded his luggage into his Mercedes. He always drove himself to the airport, but this time he'd asked me to drive him so he wouldn't have to pay for long-term parking. Another small gift from the universe. I agreed without hesitation. The drive to the airport took 40 minutes. We talked about nothing important, the weather, the garden, some upcoming charity event I'd supposedly be attending. He didn't notice that I'd been unusually quiet for the past few days. Or if he did, he didn't care enough to ask why. When we pulled up to the terminal, I helped him unload his bags. He had 2 large suitcases and a carry-on, expensive leather luggage I'd given him for Christmas 3 years ago, back when I still thought our marriage meant something. We stood on the sidewalk outside Departures, and for a moment I looked at him, really looked at him. He was 58 years old, still handsome in that distinguished way some men achieve as they age. Gray at the temples, laugh lines around his eyes, the confidence of someone who'd never been denied anything he wanted. He'd built a successful career, had a beautiful family, lived in a mansion. And he'd thrown it all away for a 34-year-old woman who probably saw him as a meal ticket. The thing that struck me in that moment was how little I felt. I'd expected anger or sadness or something. But standing there, looking at the man I'd spent more than half my life with, I felt nothing. He was a stranger. Maybe he always had been. He pulled me into a hug, and I let him. I felt his arms around me, smelled his cologne, the same brand he'd worn for years, and I thought about all the times I'd believed in this, in us, in the idea that love and commitment meant something. "I'll miss you," he said into my hair. "Have a safe flight," I replied. He pulled back, holding me at arm's length, and that's when I smiled. That real, genuine smile that came from somewhere deep inside. The smile of a woman who knows something you don't. The smile of someone who's about to take back everything you stole. He looked confused for just a second. His brow furrowed slightly, and I saw him register that something was different, something was off. But then he shook his head slightly, dismissed whatever instinct was trying to warn him, and picked up his bags. "See you in a week," he said. I waved goodbye and watched him walk through the automatic doors into the terminal. I stood there until he disappeared into the crowd, until I was absolutely certain he was gone. Then I got back in the car, pulled out of the airport, and made a phone call. "He's on his way to London," I told Patricia. "Do it." By the time Robert's plane took off at 11, the divorce papers had been filed with the Hartford Superior Court. By noon, a process server had delivered copies to his office. I'd specifically requested they not serve him at home, wanting his colleagues to know, wanting word to spread through that firm like wildfire. By 2 o'clock, a locksmith was at the house, changing every lock on every door. Christopher arrived at 3. My son, my beautiful boy who looked so much like his father, who'd inherited Robert's height and build but thankfully my empathy. He was 22 years old, fresh out of college, standing in the driveway with a worried expression as he watched the locksmith work. "Mom, what's going on?" he asked. I'd practiced this conversation 100 times in my head, but actually saying the words was harder than I'd expected. We went inside, sat in the living room, and I told him everything. About the affair, about the lies, about the divorce papers that had been filed hours ago. I showed him some of the messages, not the explicit ones, but enough to prove I wasn't making this up, that this wasn't some midlife crisis or misunderstanding. He was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then he asked the question I'd been dreading, "Does Amanda know?" I shook my head. "I'm calling her after this. I wanted to tell you both in person, but she's in Chicago and—" "It's okay, Mom," he interrupted. He moved to sit beside me on the couch, put his arm around my shoulders. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry this happened to you." And that's when I broke. For the first time since discovering Robert's betrayal, I let myself cry. Not delicate tears, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere primal. Christopher held me while I fell apart, and I loved him more in that moment than I'd thought possible. After I'd cried myself out, after I'd washed my face and pulled myself together, I called Amanda. That conversation was harder. She was furious, not at me but at her father. She wanted to fly home immediately, but I told her not to, that I was fine, that Christopher was here with me. She made me promise to call her every day, and I agreed. That night, Christopher and I ordered Chinese food and ate it in the living room, something we'd never been allowed to do when Robert was home. We watched a movie neither of us paid attention to, and around 11 my phone rang. Robert. Christopher looked at me, eyebrows raised. I stared at the phone for a long moment, then answered. Eleanor. His voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the rage underneath. What the hell is going on? You got the papers then, I said calmly. This is insane. You can't do this while I'm out of the country, you can't lock me out of my own house. It's not your house, Robert. Silence. I could practically hear him trying to process what I'd said. What are you talking about? The deed. It's in my name. Only my name. Has been for 15 years. The house is mine. Not ours. Mine. More silence. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. The rage was still there, but now there was something else, fear. We'll discuss this when I get back. No, I said simply. We won't. We'll discuss it through our attorneys. Don't bother coming to the house when you land. The locks are changed, and I've installed security cameras. If you show up, I'll call the police. Patricia will send you information about where to stay. You can't do this. I already have. Have a nice time in London, Robert. Try to enjoy the trip. It's probably the last first-class flight you'll be taking for a while. I hung up. Christopher was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Then, slowly, he started to smile. That was incredibly badass, Mom. I laughed, a real laugh that felt foreign and wonderful. Thank you, sweetheart. My phone immediately started ringing again. I declined the call, then blocked Robert's number. Let him rage to his attorneys. Let him try to figure out how his perfect plan to have everything, the devoted wife at home, the young girlfriend, the big house, the prestige, had fallen apart. That night, I slept better than I had in months. I slept in the guest room, unable to face the bed I'd shared with Robert, but I slept deeply and dreamlessly. When I woke the next morning, sunlight streaming through the windows, I felt lighter than I had in years. It wasn't over. I knew that. The divorce would be ugly, and Robert would fight for the house, for every penny he could get. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like myself. Not Mrs. Robert Patterson. Just Eleanor. Just me. The next 6 months were a battlefield. Robert fought viciously, just as Patricia had predicted. He hired the most expensive divorce attorney in Connecticut, a man with a reputation for destroying opposing parties. They argued that the house was marital property despite the deed, that my inheritance money had been commingled with marital funds, that I wasn't entitled to the life Robert had provided for me. But Patricia was better. She documented every lie Robert told, every inconsistency in his story. She subpoenaed his phone records, his credit card statements, his hotel receipts. She built an airtight case that proved the affair, proved his deception, proved that he'd systematically lied to me and our children for over a year. The deposition was brutal. I sat across from Robert in a conference room, Patricia on one side of me, her associate on the other, and I answered every question his attorney threw at me with calm precision. Yes, I'd known about the affair before filing. No, I had not attempted reconciliation. Yes, I believed the marriage was irretrievably broken. No, I did not want anything from him except what was legally mine. Robert looked haggard. The affair with Jessica had imploded within days of my filing. Apparently, she wasn't interested in a man going through an expensive divorce. He was living in a corporate apartment, his reputation at the firm damaged, his carefully constructed life in shambles. I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel some satisfaction watching him squirm. But mostly, I felt tired. Tired of fighting, tired of reliving the betrayal, tired of being legally bound to someone I no longer knew. The breakthrough came in month 4 of the proceedings. Patricia's investigator uncovered something neither of us had expected. Jessica wasn't Robert's first affair. There had been another woman, 5 years ago, another marketing consultant he'd met through work. That affair had lasted almost 2 years before fizzling out. 5 years ago. I tried to remember what I'd been doing 5 years ago. Amanda had been finishing college. Christopher had been in high school. We'd taken a family trip to Italy that summer, our last vacation as a complete family unit. I'd thought we were happy. I'd thought we were solid. I'd been living a lie for so much longer than I'd realized. When Patricia presented this evidence to Robert's attorney, along with the bank records showing Robert had rented an apartment for that woman for 18 months, an apartment paid for with marital funds, the tone of the negotiations changed dramatically. Suddenly, Robert's attorney was talking settlement. Suddenly, they weren't fighting quite so hard for the house. The final settlement came through in January, almost exactly a year after I'd first walked into Patricia's office. I kept the house, free and clear. Robert kept his pension and his 401k. We split the remaining assets roughly 60-40 in my favor, with the 60% acknowledging both his infidelity and his misuse of marital funds. He'd pay me spousal support for 7 years, not a fortune, but enough to supplement my social security and the part-time job I'd taken at a local art gallery. I signed the papers in Patricia's office on a cold Tuesday morning. The moment I put pen to paper, completing my signature for the last time as Eleanor Patterson, I felt something release in my chest. 32 years, dissolved in ink on legal paper. How do you feel? Patricia asked after everything was signed and notarized. I thought about it for a long moment. Free, I finally said. I feel free. The house felt different after the divorce was final. Bigger somehow and quieter, but in a good way. I walked through rooms I'd decorated, spaces I'd filled with the artifacts of a family life, and I started to see them differently. Not as a museum to what I'd lost, but as a canvas for what I could create. I redecorated the master bedroom first, got rid of that awful king-size bed and replaced it with a queen in a completely different style. I painted the walls a soft sage green, a color Robert had always hated, and hung art I'd chosen myself, not pieces selected to impress guests at dinner parties. I converted Robert's study into a reading room, lined the walls with bookshelves and filled them with novels and poetry collections I'd never had time to read. I bought a comfortable chair and a good reading lamp, and some evenings I'd sit in there for hours, lost in someone else's story, grateful for the quiet. Christopher visited often during his first year in San Francisco, flying home for long weekends. Amanda came home for Christmas, bringing her boyfriend, now fiancé, with her. We sat around the dining room table, the 3 of us plus Amanda's fiancé, and it felt right. Smaller than it used to be, but more honest. More real. Amanda asked me once if I was angry with their father. We were sitting in the sunroom, drinking coffee, watching snow fall in the backyard. It was a fair question. I thought about it carefully before answering. I told her. For a long time, I was so angry I could barely breathe. Angry at him for the lies, for the betrayal, for making me feel like a fool. But anger is exhausting, sweetheart. And at some point, I realized that holding on to it was only hurting me, not him. So you're not angry anymore? She asked. I'm disappointed, I said. Disappointed that he was so much less than I thought he was. But angry? No. Mostly I feel sorry for him. He destroyed his family, damaged his reputation, lost his home, all for what? A few years of feeling young again? It's sad, really. She reached over and squeezed my hand. I'm proud of you, Mom. Those words meant more than I could express. Robert and I have almost no contact now. He remarried last year, some woman he met at a conference, 10 years younger than him. I heard through the grapevine that they're living in a condo in West Hartford, nothing like the estate we used to share. His career never fully recovered from the scandal. He's still at the firm, but he'll never make equity partner now. The whispers, the judgment, they followed him. I don't take pleasure in his downfall. But I don't mourn it either. He made his choices, and he's living with the consequences. Just like I'm living with mine. The difference is, my consequences feel like freedom. I'm 63 years old now, and I'm building a life that's entirely mine. I work 3 days a week at the gallery, not because I need the money, but because I enjoy it. I've joined a book club and a painting class. I travel, small trips, nothing extravagant, but places I want to see on my own terms. Last fall, I spent 2 weeks in Vermont, watching the leaves change and staying in a small bed and breakfast where no one knew who I was or where I'd come from. I've gone on a few dates, nothing serious, just dinners and conversations with men I've met through friends or online. It's strange, navigating romance in my 60s after more than 3 decades with one person. But it's also exhilarating. Every coffee date, every tentative first kiss, feels like a reclamation of something I thought I'd lost. People sometimes ask me if I regret the way I handled everything. If I wish I'd confronted Robert sooner, or tried counseling, or given him a chance to explain. The answer is complicated. Do I wish my marriage hadn't been a lie? Of course. Do I wish I hadn't wasted years on someone who didn't value me? Absolutely. But do I regret taking control, protecting myself, ensuring that when everything fell apart I'd have something solid to stand on? Not for a second. That moment at the airport, when I smiled and waved goodbye, when I knew what was coming and he had no idea, that was the moment I took my life back. Not through anger or revenge, but through planning and patience and refusing to be a victim. The house was just a symbol, really. What mattered was that I'd stopped letting someone else control my story. If you've made it this far in my story, if you've listened to every twist and turn, every moment of pain and triumph, I want to thank you. Sharing this hasn't been easy, but it's been cathartic. If my story resonates with you, if you know someone who needs to hear it, please share it. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, what your thoughts are. And check the description box below for more stories like this. Stories about women who refused to stay broken, who found strength they didn't know they had, who rewrote their own endings. Because here's what I've learned, it's never too late to start over. Never too late to demand better for yourself. Never too late to walk away from what's destroying you and toward what might save you. I'm Eleanor. I'm 63 years old. I live in a beautiful house in Connecticut that's entirely mine. I have 2 adult children who respect and love me. I have friends and hobbies and plans for the future. I have peace. And I have absolutely no regrets. The house deed has only my signature on it. It always did. Robert just never bothered to check. Sometimes the best revenge isn't dramatic or explosive. Sometimes it's just surviving, thriving, and refusing to let someone else write the ending to your story. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. Check the description box for more stories that will inspire you, challenge you, and remind you of your own strength. This is my story. And I'm still writing it, one day at a time.